In previous lectures, we focused on the many ways in which individual characteristics, whether they are cognitive or are a reflection of differences in personality, how these characteristics affect an individual's pattern of behavior. As an important next step in these discussions, we need also to consider how the broader cultural and social context in which an individual grows up will influence these behavioral patterns. Until now, we have been considering the process of responding to a stimulus from the environment as one that takes place largely within the individual. In their 2013 book titled Clash, Marcus and Connor suggest that even though we as individuals often perceive this process of behavioral response as consciously and intentionally driven, quote, psychologists have long known that most of what actually drives your behavior sails under the radar of your conscious awareness. A significant part of the process of evaluating how we should respond to an environmental stimulus involves differentiating between those types of behavior that are appropriate in the given circumstances and those that are inappropriate. Consistent with Marcus and Connor's view that what actually drives our behavior sails under the radar of our conscious awareness, Benet-Martinez and Oishi suggest that we learn what is appropriate and what is not appropriate from our cultural environment. They suggest that one of the roles of culture is to set the values and norms that govern behavior, and in so doing, defining those characteristics and behaviors that are deemed appropriate and inappropriate. Benet-Martinez and Oishi go on to define culture as shared meaning systems that provide the standards for perceiving, believing, evaluating, communicating, and acting among those who share a language, a historic period, and a geographic location. Marcus and Connor offer a similar perspective. They define the concept of culture as the ideas, institutions, and interactions that tell a group of people how to think, feel, and act. We may perceive that our behavioral response to a given circumstance is under our individual control, while in fact our response will inevitably include cultural factors we have internalized earlier, often in childhood. Marcus and Connor propose a model they refer to as the cultural cycle. As part of this cycle, they suggest that our behavior is often driven by a series of nested interactions. At the center of the cycle is the individual, reflecting the cognitive and emotional patterns a person has developed in combination with her or his personality traits and internal motivating characteristics. However, we have developed these characteristics as part of our association with those in our immediate social environment. For young children, this environment includes parents and family. As we get older, it comes to include those in our school, our place of work, and those in our religious or other social groups we participate in. An important part of how we respond to those in our social environment reflects the cultural institutions we have learned and internalized as part of the process of growing up. These institutions can include both certain organizational forms, such as formal social or governmental groups, as well as rules of behavior. These rules are sometimes written and formally adopted and sometimes simply understood without the necessity of written instructions. These social and institutional influences in turn reflect the broader general ideas or concepts that create the overall structure for our culture. In this manner, culture creates expected norms of behavior. However, these norms will often differ among different cultural groups. For example, in many Western cultures, when we first greet someone we don't know, we will hold out our hand with the expectation that the other person will do the same so we can shake hands. If another person held out her or his hand for me to shake, but I did not respond, she or he could easily perceive me as rude. By contrast, in many Eastern cultures, offering a stranger my hand expecting that he or she will grasp and shake it may come across as rude. Instead, the courteous thing for me to do might be to offer a slight bow of my head and shoulders, thereby intending to indicate respect for the other person. Writing in 1991, Marcus and Kitayama explored the fundamentally different role the self plays in different cultural traditions. In their research, they compared and contrasted the role of the self in the United States with that in Japan. They were able to identify two fundamentally different cultural models of the relationship between the individual and the broader social or cultural group. They labeled these contrasting models as the independent view of the self, as reflected in U.S. society, and the interdependent view of the self, as reflected in Japanese society. They described the independent self as reflecting, quote, faith in the inherent separateness of distinct persons, unquote. The normative imperative of this culture is to become independent from others and to discover and express one's unique attributes. From this perspective, one is not only free to pursue his or her own goals independently from those in the surrounding social network, but is often encouraged to do so. By contrast, the interdependent self, as reflected in many non-Western cultures, is based on the perception of, quote, the fundamental connectedness of human beings to each other. Experiencing interdependence entails seeing oneself as part of an encompassing social relationship and recognizing that one's behavior is determined, contingent on, and to a large extent organized by what the actor perceives to be the thoughts, feelings, and actions of others in the relationship, unquote. In this context, the normative imperative is often to put aside individual goals and to work to attain what is best for the entire social group, whether it is the family or the community. This chart describes the differences in the concept of self one is expected to develop in those cultures that embody the independent self as compared to those that reflect the interdependent self. The independent person sees himself or herself as existing to a large extent separately from the broader social context. The tasks of an independent person are to be unique, to express yourself, to say what's on your mind, and to set and pursue your own goals based on your own sense of self. You use the others around you as a basis of comparison and get to raise and to get a sense of how am I doing? By contrast, the interdependent self sees herself or himself as part of and not separate from a broader cultural context. Her or his tasks are to gain a sense of belonging by trying to fit in, by speaking in largely indirect terms, and by acknowledging one's proper place in the broader social culture and structure. One acts as others expect and tries to place the needs of others ahead of one's own needs. The independent individual gains a sense of self-esteem by being able to express one's uniqueness, while the interdependent individual gains self-esteem by maintaining harmony in the relationship with others. Moving beyond the broad differentiation between societies that value independence and those that value interdependence, we might also ask what other forms of cultural expectations of behavior might take. I expect we might all agree that nearly all cultures include behavioral expectations based on gender. As Marcus and Connor describe in their book, Clash, if you thought that gender differences in selves and statuses arose mostly from biology, you could be forgiven. Rather than coursing through their veins, leaping across the synapses, or lighting up the cerebral lobes of men and women, the causes reside in the products and practices of men's and women's daily lives. Marcus and Connor go on to emphasize the important role parents play in establishing early gender expectations for their children. They suggest that, quote, parents' different expectations for boys and girls emerge even before their children are born. When newborns greet the outside world, adults are standing by to shape the infants' selves in gendered ways. Unquote. Often, gender-based behavioral expectations overlap with the differential expectations of independence and interdependence. I believe it is fair to suggest that in the United States, girls are more likely to develop an interdependent perspective on their social environment, while boys are more likely to develop an independent perspective. These differences can in turn affect how boys and girls interact from their time in diapers through higher education. One of the places these gendered expectations are reflected is in the response of boys and girls to education in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, often referred to as the STEM fields. As suggested by Marcus and Connor, in the U.S., quote, STEM is represented as an independent undertaking, the province of lone rangers and cutthroat geniuses who can abstract theories from applications and separate signals from noise, unquote. As a consequence of this cultural representation, data consistently show that girls tend to show less interest in STEM fields, and when they do study them, they often do less well than boys. An example of this effect was shown in 2005 in a study by Lorenzo and colleagues in which they compared men and women freshman students at Harvard University who had enrolled as incoming students in an introductory physics class. They found that coming out of high school when assessed using a standardized test of physics knowledge, the women students on average knew less physics than the men students. By the end of Harvard's traditional lecture-based physics course, this gender gap had widened, indicating that men had increased their knowledge of physics by a greater amount than women as a result of having taken the course. As a first step in addressing this gap, the physics faculty switched from a strictly lecture format to what they referred to as a highly interactive teaching format, which included a weekly 2-hour session in which students were in small groups, seated around tables, working together on a series of tutorials and hands-on experiments. This learning model showed a striking result. Despite the women continuing to enter Harvard with a weaker knowledge of physics gained in high school, by the end of the new year-long physics class, students engaged in the highly interactive approach to learning no longer showed a gender gap in their knowledge of physics. And of additional interest was the finding that not only had the women students attained the same knowledge level as their male classmates by the end of the course, the men had also learned more physics with the new interactive model than they had with the previous traditional lecture-based model. Beyond cultural differences in expected behavior based on gender, many researchers have also suggested that there are similar cultural differences based on socioeconomic status. Writing in 2005, anthropologist Andrei Kusarov suggested that there are class-based differences in perspectives on individualism that are every bit as important as the differences we discussed above between those in the U.S. and those in Asia and other parts of the world. Based on her research looking at children in New York City from high socioeconomic status communities and those from lower socioeconomic status communities, Kusarov identified a soft upper-middle-class individualism which focuses on the cultivation and expression of unique feelings, thoughts, ideas, and preferences, and a contrasting hard working-class individualism which focuses on the cultivation of self-reliance, perseverance, determination, protectiveness, and toughness. Thus, whether we are looking at differing cultural expectations based on nationality and ethnicity, based on gender, or based on socioeconomic status, we see clear patterns of what types of behavior are expected, and we can expect children who grow up in these contexts largely to adopt and model these behavioral expectations.